From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
And good morning and welcome to Face the State here on the Montana Television Network. Happy to have you with us on this Sunday. I'm Jay Cohn, and with you for the next half hour, we're going to have a lively discussion, we hope, this morning about the Yellowstone River, perhaps one of the most iconic rivers in the state of Montana, certainly my favorite, and maybe you have some personal feelings about this awesome river, the last free-flowing river in the lower 48 states. There is a symposium coming up within the next week as we take a look at the challenges facing the Yellowstone and some of the communities along the way, all the way from Gardner to its confluence with the Missouri over in the state of North Dakota. So we have a panel here this morning to talk about what lies ahead for the Yellowstone River. First of all, we'd like to introduce our panel. Next to me, immediately left, is Susan Gilberts, an associate professor of geography at MSU Billings. She also directs the environmental studies there. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay.
In the middle, we have Carrie Lesueur, an author and environmental attorney based here in Billings, and she has some intriguing experiences dealing with the Yellowstone. She's going to share her experience and what she sees coming down the path. And also, last but certainly not least, we have Kayan Ostavar, Associate Professor of Environmental Science from Rocky Mountain College. And Susan, thank you all for being here on short notice to fill in our audience this morning about the FLOW project. Susan, you were the facilitator in one of the preliminary discussions. Tell us about FLOW, how this whole thing came about, if you would.
Well, it's really the brainchild of Sherry Cornett, a local artist, who came up to our campus and asked about providing us the opportunity to install one of her art projects, FLOW, which is based on art inspired by water. And our gallery, which is run by Leanne Gilbertson, really requires that we incorporate student activities with anything that goes on in our gallery. Mm-hmm. And so Leanna called me and asked, you know, what were my ideas, and it just kind of mushroomed into this really great symposium. It was a month-long program, actually.
And tell me about the Yellowstone River. Do you have a special place in your heart for the Yellowstone, as most of us do?
I do. I came to Montana 13 years ago, and within the first year of being here, I got involved in a research project looking at the cumulative effects of human activities on the river. That project is just coming to a close, which is the symposium that you mentioned that will be coming up next week. Mm-hmm. And so I have been working on rivers and river issues here in Montana for 13 years, and really the Yellowstone is just the focus of my energy and my interest.
Kahan, let's talk to you just a little bit and get Rocky Mountain College's involvement spelled out. With your work at Rocky Mountain College, you try to get your students involved, and they've been very involved in studying in the Yellowstone now for nearly a decade or more.
Yeah, and starting with just our courses. So a lot of our courses are actually revolve around the Yellowstone River and understanding how our community engages with that river in a number of different ways. We have a course, an early environmental science course, where students go out and visit all the different facilities, infrastructure, city facilities, corporate facilities on the river, and understand how we are mimicking natural processes or maybe impacting those natural processes, and how we can basically work on all those to improve them and make sure that we don't impact the river in an unsustainable fashion.
The Yellowstone flows for 670 miles from its start up near Fishing Bridge out of Yellowstone Lake, and then flows into the Missouri a few miles into the state of North Dakota. Along the way, there are 11 conservation districts, and I guess part of this study is to get those conservation districts that span the river from Gardner all the way past Glendive, and kind of have a brainstorming session on how we can help this river survive the long term.
I'll let Susan speak to that. Okay. She's been involved with that project a lot longer than I have.
All right.
Yeah, all those districts came together to help with this cumulative effects study, and their interest is really to try to address the river as a whole and to understand the river more comprehensively, mm-hmm. rather than just maybe your section, which might be Miles City, but that's an important section if you live there, but that's impacted by what happens upstream, and then you can have an impact on communities downstream. So the conservation districts are really at the local hub of how that understanding of the river might be more complete. And they have been involved in this from the very beginning, and so we owe them a lot of respect for being involved.
The third member of our panel this morning is Carrie LeSueur, local author and environmental engineer. You say you do a lot with energy as well, Carrie, not to pigeonhole you into an environmental attorney, but tell us how you got involved in this project, and you have a little different perspective coming from your line of work.
All right, I'm not the scientist, and I was pulled in fairly late in the project and asked to speak at this symposium by Sherry Cornett and Susan. And when you say Yellowstone River to an environmental lawyer, my first thought goes down a Clean Water Act track. But I started to think a little more about my personal experience with the river, and many generations of my family have lived and worked and recreated along this river in particular and its tributaries, and so my memories were around fishing with my dad and my grandpa on the Stillwater, and things I take my own kids to do today on the river. And so I started looking into this new area of law around guardianship of future generations, and how we can create a voice for the river and a voice for future generations that will protect everything we enjoy and love about this river for generations to come.
That's an interesting concept of the river needs a voice, and I guess your line of work, you were saying like a guardian of the river is maybe
Right.
something all of us need to think about, but legally there's an avenue for this river to have a voice.
Well, we create guardians already in the courts for people who don't have a voice and who need one. We create guardian ad litems for infant children. They can't speak to us, they can't tell us what they need, but clearly there's a different interest there than anything that already exists in the proceedings. So we have this concept of bringing in a third-party guardian who tries to understand what that voiceless interest is. And future generations are in some ways the same. We need to find a way to speak for them. We need to find a way to speak for the river. If we can give personhood to corporations, I wonder why we can't figure out what the personhood interests of the Yellowstone River are.
Interesting.
That's what makes the river really fascinating, Jay, is that you can bring so many disciplines to it in a very meaningful way. You know, we can certainly bring the biological studies and the hydrologies and the geomorphology of the river, which is fascinating, but we can bring the legal aspects. The students brought art interpretations to the project, so it's really it's such a vital part of our community, and everyone has an interest in how that functions for us.
And the communities that span those 670 miles of the Yellowstone are as diverse as you can get as well, from little town of Gardner, which is tourist, Yellowstone Park, kind of the gateway, to Billings, more the industrial side of things, to the agricultural interest down towards Miles City and Glendive, and of course the pallid sturgeon, the dinosaur of the fish that I think all of us have learned to appreciate. Kehan, you've focused some of your studies specifically on the wildlife of the Yellowstone. Tell us a little bit about that diversity.
Thank you. Mostly through students. So in 2011, we had the large floods on the Yellowstone, and Rocky Mountain College decided to put some resources towards developing a Yellowstone River Research Center. And so we set up this research center as kind of a unique entity where students would apply for funding to carry out research on the river, so it's a way to engage students. Their projects have to require a community component, a community service component, and so it's a way to engage the community. And then we have a steering committee on that within that institution that incorporates state and federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, corporations in the community, and other institutions like MSU, and Susan actually sits on that steering committee. So they're the ones that make the decisions of what projects move forward, how much funding those students get, and the students then try to find collaborative funds to again focus those efforts on the river. So we've used wildlife species as indicators of the ecosystem integrity, and we test certain organisms for potential aquatic contaminants has been one focus, and also looking at connectivity within the river system, trying to use species that tell us that something maybe is changing within that ecosystem in a way to maybe react and learn about how we can better carry out our practices on that system.
And so what have you learned? What jumps out at you as
there's a number of threats to the system that the study, students' work in the study have identified, and those are primarily the changes in flow, changes in channel migration, the riprapping and bank armoring that we've done, And so different species that we look at can help identify where those changes are occurring most rapidly. Cottonwoods, for example, don't reestablish unless you have floods, and you need sandbars and new habitat for the cottonwoods to reestablish. Bank swallows will lose their colonies if we riprap colonies, and bank swallows are a perfect example of a species that helps us identify changes to the system because they need exposed banks. And as we're losing those with riprap, and we've armored now, the study identified 136 miles, I believe, of bank that have been armored of the 670 miles of river on the Yellowstone River. So we're still very pristine, but we have to be careful that we don't move too far down that road and not allow a natural functioning ecosystem.
Right, and it kind of depends on where you are on the river. There are parts of the river that are probably very much like they were 100 years ago, with virtually no change at all. And then you look at other parts of the river, for instance here by Billings, where the armoring is almost complete on the river, and that really changes the dynamic of the river. And it shows up in really problematic ways beyond the biological changes, as particularly to the fisheries, but also in terms of, we think that was in part, some of these scourings that happen that are exposing pipelines, and then we have these pipeline breaks on the river, is probably because when you change the dynamic of the river and you channelize it, then the power of the river just starts working the bottom of the river, and that's where those exposures come from.
I was going to mention the pipeline breaks. It's been two separate incidents, one by Laurel back in, was it 2011?
Yeah.
Back when the floods, and then the most recent one just a year ago down near Glendive, which threatened and did in fact contaminate that city's water supply for a short time. Carrie, that's where you come in as an environmental attorney.
Right, I get those calls.
Not only is the Yellowstone River important and well recognized in Montana, but I can tell you from our newsroom, when those pipeline spills occurred, people first thought we were talking about Yellowstone Park around the country. They were like, oh my gosh, Yellowstone Park is impacted. But this river really has important ties all across not only in Montana history, but across the country. It's just an iconic river.
It's very close to people's hearts.
Right.
And so we run into this, there's a conflict going on between private property rights and, I've got my 160 acres and nobody ought to be able to tell me what to do with them. And a problem that's referred to in legal scholarship is the tragedy of the commons. And it's something that we all value a lot, we all want to use, we all have some kind of use for, and so we each go in and let's say we all own some kind of common field, and you want to graze your cattle and you want to graze your sheep, and I've got some goats, and so we all go in there and we use it as much as we possibly can, and pretty soon the damage is such that its value is less to all of us. And the river has some aspects that work that way. If every landowner along it does the riprap and the shielding, we start to have some impacts on the river as a whole and its functions for everyone, for every creature, every individual who wants to use it, that reduce the value. So how do we balance that individual property owner's interest in protecting their shoreline with the interest of everyone along the river in having a functioning ecosystem? And that's a
delicate balance.
That's a tough, common problem to solve.
And the thing that we really have to think about is trending. Are we trending toward keeping our river healthy, or are we trending toward making our river something that's really not very attractive or even productive for us anymore? And rather than talk about a threshold, well, can we take it to this point and then stop? I really, that has some value as a concept, but I think it's better for us as a society to think in terms of which way are we trending? Are we trending towards positive or negative outcomes of our actions?
And which way are we trending?
Well, we know we can show that we really do make a difference on the river with some of our activities, and that in some places we probably already need to go in and do some restoration activities where we need to restore some side channels. In other cases, we probably just need to protect the ability of the river to do its normal mechanics. And so there's a new program to perhaps go to a landowner who's willing to let the sloughing happen, where pieces of their farm
yeah,
actually fall into the
yeah.
river, and to pay them for that, because that's valuable to all of us. And those easement projects are pretty new. Some people don't like them, but it's an interesting idea to say to a landowner, we all have a stake in you letting the river do what it needs to do. And so those are new ideas that are coming out in Montana.
Okay,
Yeah.
and that sloughing's been going on for centuries and centuries. So it's the natural evolution of that river.
And I think what we've learned also is the more natural we can allow this river to behave, the better everyone will be. The organisms that are in that river and the humans that use that water on that river depend on based on that lifeblood of river that comes through all those 11 counties and the communities on the river. So if we, in that channel migration easement opportunity is a new tool, but it's pretty unique. I don't know of very many other states that actually use that yet, and it's allowing that natural process to occur, and in a sense, providing resources to those landowners that are willing to take that impact, right? To not rip-rap their bank and then divert the water to their neighbor.
And the other thing that we have to think about also is flooding.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from a human perspective, we almost always look at flooding as a bad thing. But in terms of a river system, flooding is really an important part of the system in keeping the health of the ecosystem in the riparian area. And the riparian areas are vital to us in lots of ways. They're not just beautiful to look at, but they are also great habitat for all kinds of organisms. And because of the lushness of the riparian area, it's able to actually work towards filtering our water. So as potential contaminants are headed toward the river itself, either through underground or water flows or surface flow, that riparian zone with all that vegetation in there starts to take some of that up and use that in a way that keeps it out of our actual water supply. So there's lots and lots of reasons to keep our riparian areas healthy as well.
So it sounds like flooding of a river is similar to a fire in a forest. Is that a decent analogy?
I don't think that's bad at all, because, for instance, the regeneration of cottonwood depend on a flood.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look around the river, we do have some beautiful stands of cottonwoods. Most of them are quite old, and we have very few places where we have young stands of cottonwoods coming in, and that's because we just don't have the flooding that we used to have.
If you're just joining us today here on Face the State, we're talking about the Yellowstone River, big symposium in Billings coming up in the coming weekend. And just to reintroduce our panel, we have Susan Gilberts from MSUB, the Environmental Studies Department up there, Associate Professor of Geography. Carrie LeSueur, author and environmental attorney, is with us as well. And Kehan Ostovar from Rocky Mountain College's Environmental Studies program is joining us. Kehan, talk a little bit about, if you will, the wildlife and the habitat that Yellowstone River offers. Three most endangered species in my reading is the pallid sturgeon, the piping plovers, and the least tern. Most people have heard of the sturgeon. Tell me about those other two species.
The other two are found further down, downstream on the Yellowstone, and they depend on basically exposed sandbars, and that again requires flooding, as Susan was talking about with cottonwood. So they're the species that are tied to flooding. The sturgeon are also tied to the spring pulses floods that we get, and that stimulates their spawning instinct to move. Sturgeon are having trouble moving because of basically barriers that have been placed, irrigation diversions have been placed on
When
the
we
river.
call it the last free-flowing river in the lower 48, there are a few diversion dams that people would maybe challenge that statement. Back in the 50s and 60s, they were talking about damming that river right outside of Livingston. Thank God the Army Corps of Engineers, in my opinion, didn't get their way on that. At the time, that was a viable threat. Of course, they felt damming up the river and flooding the Paradise Valley was a good thing. Fortunately, that did not happen. I think history will show that many of the politicians in Montana stepped up and made sure that wasn't going to happen. Was that a good decision?
I think it's given us an opportunity to learn from this river that's not dammed. As the longest undammed river in the United States, we can study the dynamics that we do have that are still remaining, and maybe potentially use that information and knowledge to help restore other river systems that are very impacted around the country and the world, actually.
At the same time, we do probably in Montana need to think about storage. water storage.
Yeah, especially this year.
Especially the years like this, exactly.
Just had the lowest amount of precipitation in the month of February ever.
Exactly.
Since records have been taken.
And so when that spring pulse comes through, that pulse of water, or pulses in a good year, that's an opportunity to hold water in Montana for use later in the year. And without storage capabilities, that's really hard to do. Now, there are lots of ways to store water. It doesn't necessarily mean a great big dam. In fact, some of the flood irrigation that we've done, for a century now in this valley is really a storage system, because you flood irrigate, you supersaturate the floodplain with irrigation water, and then that migrates back to the river eventually, either subsurface or surface-wise.
Carrie, from your perspective, what's the biggest challenge facing the Yellowstone? Biggest threat, perhaps, but a challenge, maybe not necessarily a threat.
Well, as Susan just mentioned, we're coming into an era where water availability is going to be absolutely critical, and fresh water will become more and more valuable. There's so much pressure on rivers to the south of us and to the west of us. The Columbia, the Colorado are arriving at the shore with, the Columbia is more protected than the Colorado, but the Colorado is a trickle by the time it reaches the ocean. And we have this chance to do something wiser with the Yellowstone. We have really good information about how important it is to keep this a free-flowing river and to allow it to behave as rivers behave, but the pressure just to get hold of those molecules of H2O is going to get more and more powerful as years go by, and that's I think the real challenge in protecting future generations and handing down something that will be recognizable as the river we know and love.
Kehan, you have a study about turtles in the river. Tell us about that. Because
so we're looking at a very aquatic turtle. Not too many people have probably seen these, but they're called spiny softshell turtles, and this is about as far north and west as they get. So they get quite large. They are restricted to aquatic habitats, and we're working with Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and have had several students working on this, but we're taking blood from them actually and looking at contaminants in their blood at this point in time. But they're a species that are, again, tied to disturbed areas at times, need certain conditions in that water. They need to nest in gravel very, very close to the river, and that would be disturbed sites, the new gravel sites. So we're looking at this species and trying to get an understanding. We're actually sampling turtles from the Musselshell, the Yellowstone, and the Bighorn River, trying to look at differences in those systems and see what might be causing, in this case, heavy metal contaminants.
one thing I read about the Yellowstone has 56 species of fish, the most of any Montana river. How are they doing?
I think for the most part, again, it depends on your perspective, which fish you are on the system, right? But the pallid sturgeon we know is having trouble, but other fish species are probably doing okay. There's been some large fish studies done through the Yellowstone River Conservation District Council. They've done, looked at a lot of different species actually, and I had a student looking at fish passage. So we've already talked about passage a little bit with diversions, but a lot of the tributaries are also extremely important for the Yellowstone. A lot of those tributaries also have barriers and dams on them. Pryor Creek, which is just downstream of Billings, recently had a fish passage barrier rebuilt, and it's allowed fish to now come into that system that have not been able to come into that system for over 100 years. And we actually caught a turtle that we previously tagged upstream on the Yellowstone actually moved up into that system as well last summer. So we know the softshell turtles and the fish are coming back into that system. Wildlife returns very quickly if we provide the opportunity. And we have the knowledge now to do that.
Another thing the study looks at is the invasive species, and I'm talking about what it mentions, the Russian olive trees and the noxious weeds. You don't have to go too far here in Billings to find a whole bunch of Russian olive trees that people are trying to get rid of, but what's been their cumulative effect?
Well, they're very thirsty.
Yeah.
And they also ruin the habitat of the native habitat. It just becomes such a tangle and they're very thorny, and so even our even deer and raccoons and kind of normal wildlife don't even like to be in those
thorny
thickets.
if you've ever tangled
they're
with
terrible
Russian olive.
thickets. So they're really problematic, and they're hard to get rid of. You have to, our best technology now is this machine that cuts them off and then actually treats the stump almost immediately, because even just within a few minutes the stump can seal over and then it'll come back to life. Yeah. So those are really those are really hard to deal with. Knapweed, it goes on, and so those are some of the challenges. The other challenge is that half of it, what we've been talking about is the river corridor, but when you really think about the basin itself, half of the basin is in Wyoming, and we share the basin with Wyoming, and then it all drains into the Missouri, which drains into the Mississippi, and so people downstream call on us to manage our water in Montana as well. And what I would say to our community is that the more we demonstrate that we are taking care of our water, the better we are in the larger political context of people saying, well, you don't care, you're not taking care of your river anyway, so we'll take care of things down here because you apparently don't care up there. So the more we do up here to show that we do care about our river and the health of our river and the users that we have here in Montana, the legitimate rights holders that we have, the better off we are in the larger political economy of it.
Carrie, when people hear a legal guardian for the river is needed, what has been your response? And there have been pushback against that? It's a kind of a new concept. We discussed it briefly earlier.
Well, I really preached to the choir at the symposium at MSUB. It was people who really wanted to hear new ideas about how to protect the river, so they were very enthusiastic. And there's just a wonderful body of almost literature that's grown up around the idea of the rights of rivers, the rights of waters, and it kind of is on the border between literature and law, which I love. But I do hope that fellow Montanans understand what a precious thing this is we have. I've lived farther downstream. I've lived near the Mississippi, and the clarity of the waters and our ability to trout fish and boat and feel clean and safe in our rivers is not something every American has. It's absolutely precious.
We take it for granted, and it's something we shouldn't. Kehan, what do you hope people get out of this symposium coming up next weekend?
I hope that the knowledge of, there's an incredible amount of research, right? 15 plus years of research will get out to the community, and it's also just an incredibly collaborative effort. All these different counties that participated, but also the breadth of stakeholders involved, I think, is very, very significant, very unique. Susan's group was able to pull all these different people together, and she's still doing it today, right? She's able to bring in different entities serving on the Rockies Steering Committee for our Yellowstone River Research Center, and continually pulling partners together that have an interest in the system that we all want to be better, right? And I think what I try to do is instill that next generation of caretakers or river watchers, maybe, as Carrie might say, and instill that in the students. And hopefully we're training them to be that next generation of river watchers.
Great to see MSUB and Rocky collaborating.
Yeah,
It's really unique, yeah.
Susan, the quote in one of the articles I read where the Mississippi is referred to as Old Man River, and you said the Yellowstone's more like the prom queen.
Yes.
Tell us, as we finish off our program this morning, that's a great analogy.
It is wonderful, and I had the privilege a few years ago to interview myself and my team. We interviewed over 300 people who live along the river, and that's one of the wonderful quotes, but there's a whole book of quotes that I have, because the wisdom about the river is widespread, and the interests are diverse, and that project really gave me the opportunity to appreciate and really value all of the ways that the river serves our communities. And so yes, the prom queen, that's one of my favorite quotes. And the other one was a Miles City gentleman who told me, this isn't a Cabela's fantasy, this is a real river.
Indeed it is. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
The symposium comes up next weekend, the 9th and 10th at the Billings Hotel and Convention Center. You need to register if you want to take part, but sounds like it'd be worthwhile for everyone. Susan, Carrie, Kehan, thanks so much for joining us today here on Face the State. Hope you learned a little bit here on our program today. Have a great week, won't you?
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.